Okay, thank you, Edward. Good to see you all. I'm going to share PowerPoint. Let me see if it's all right. Okay, so this is my title, and I will start with a short abstract that is like the summary of what I'm going to say now. It is indisputable that language as a faculty influences cognition. The question is whether languages in their diversity also do so. I think we have good reasons to claim they do. And in order to show it, I will take as an example the evidential system of Quechua, the native language, one of the native languages of Peru. I will suggest that the characteristics of a language can favor the development of certain epistemic intuitions, forcing the speaker to pay attention to certain relations of reality or of her own subjective life, which the speaker would not have perceived if she were a speaker of another language. A collateral consequence of this approach is to show the importance of studying non-Western epistemic concepts to enrich our philosophical perspective, normally inspired by the Western one. It is a long debated topic, as we all know, from at least Harris in the 17th century, Herder and Humboldt in the 18th, Boas in the 19th, and Worf and Sapir in the 20th, whether particular languages have any influence on cognition. After a long period of skepticism about it, some recent research suggests that there is a moderate influence, but not in constraining our perception of the world or our cognition, but on leading our attention to certain relationships between events in reality. So it's a major difference between the Sapir-Whorf principle and what some people now call the Boas-Jacobson principle. The Sapir-Whorf principle, as we all know, it's a principle that claims that there are some constraints that languages establish upon speakers, whereas the Boas-Jacobson principle do not claim that. It does not claim that. It claims that languages can throw our attention or lead our attention to some aspects of reality. In its broadest version, the question is, in what way, if any, the language of a speaker shapes, to a greater or lesser degree, her perception of external reality, that's natural and social objects and events, the way she categorizes them, the cognitive mechanisms with which she processes the information that comes to it from the outside world, the mechanisms with which she categorizes and processes the mental states that make up her subjectivity, the way in which she experiences her mental states, qualia, and the attention she pays to the events of the surrounding reality and of her subjective life. I will focus on the Quechua Evidential system in order to address if it could affect the epistemic intuitions of the speakers. Additionally, I will compare the semantics of epistemic concepts in Quechua with that of English, but I will begin this part by discussing very quickly the very notion of epistemic intuition. The concept of philosophical intuition has been widely discussed in philosophy by Hitika, Nagel, Sosa, and in particular, its degree of reliability has been debated by Goldman, for instance. Traditionally, it has been understood as a type of direct, immediate, non-inferential, and incorrigible knowledge. For instance, it would be an intuition that if I know something, therefore I believe it, but not all the way around. Epistemic intuitions are cases of philosophical intuitions and are understood as immediate, mechanical, and non-reflective inclinations on epistemological issues. It is debatable whether all human beings have the same epistemic intuitions, and if so, why, or whether they vary culturally. It is also debatable whether the semantic and grammatical characteristics of languages could foster certain epistemic insights and discourage others. Like a quarter of languages in the world, Quechua has a complex evidential system. These are suffixes that express epistemic attitudes of the speaker regarding the proposition she is uttering. Thus, these suffixes express conviction, conjecture, doubt, etc., such that the formulation of a judgment or any type of statement is inexcusable or unavoidable, free of any involvement by the speaker in relation to the source of information, knowledge or not, of what it is enunciated or transmits. The evidentials show our ability to evaluate the reliability of the information that we communicate or interpret, something fundamental for the development of social intelligence. From a grammatical point of view, the evidentials constitute a system that make two things explicit. In the first place, the evidentiality itself, which would be the source of the speaker's information. Second, the epistemic modality of the speaker, which concerns the speaker's attitudes regarding the truth or validity of the proposition she states. That is, if she knows or believes the proposition. Although both dimensions, evidentiality and epistemic modality, interact, they are in principle different, since they can occur separately in a language. Some authors consider that the evidentials mark a scale of confidence that the speaker has regarding the source of information. That is, even if the speaker has not directly observed the fact that she's reporting, but she knows about it from a source that she considers extremely reliable, she could use a direct epistemic marker. Note, however, that this confidence scale does not necessarily coincide with a conviction scale, since the speaker could consider that the source of information is very reliable, but on this occasion, and for particular reasons, she could have little conviction in it. The opposite case is also conceivable. There are studies that show a certain flexibility in the use of evidentials, in particular when it comes to languages with evidentials that coexist with languages that do not have this grammatical system, which is the case in Peru, that Quechua coexists with Spanish, and there is an important degree of diglossia, that is Spanish is the language of prestige, whereas Quechua is not. And there is an interesting issue that I'm not going to discuss now. Unlike languages that lack an evidential system, such as Spanish or English, languages that do have it, like Quechua, require their speakers to make explicit the source of the speaker's information regarding the expressed proposition. This, in turn, requires them to monitor the source of information from which they have formed their epistemic attitude about the proposition. These evidentials would fulfill a function similar to that in other languages, and also in Quechua, like epistemic verbs, such as knowing, believing, asserting, suspecting, conjecturing, etc., with an important difference. While in languages that lack an evidential system, one can decide not to use an epistemic verb so that one can affirm something while remaining somehow neutral with respect to the source of information, which could also imply neutrality with respect to her epistemic attitudes, in Quechua, it would not be possible. Thus, for example, I can say in English, there is a puma, there is a panther behind the hill, without specifying my source of information. That would not be possible in Quechua. Eventually, by making my source of information explicit, I would be implicitly suggesting my degree of conviction. For example, presumably, if I saw something, I have greater certainty of it than if I was told about it. In Quechua, evidentials have 4 functions. They express the source of the speaker's information about the proposition that she states. If she has seen it, if she has been told about it, or if she infers it. This suggests her epistemic attitude toward it. If she knows, believes, suspects, etc. They point out the most important part of the sentence, that the sentence was to communicate. And they show a type of epistemic responsibility of the speaker, if she takes responsibility of her assertion and therefore expects her interlocutors to trust what she's saying. Epistemic responsibility is normally defined as the obligation that a person has to try to know all the evidence that is available to her and that is relevant to establish her beliefs or communicate something to other speakers. It is part of epistemic responsibility to feel compelled to offer reasons and evidence to support what one believes or communicates. An epistemically responsible agent would like to have true beliefs and therefore be endowed with mechanisms that allow them to have true beliefs, so that her actions are caused by those beliefs and desires. Likewise, an epistemically responsible agent would feel responsible for her verbal utterances. That is, she would communicate what she believes, and only if she has sufficient reasons and evidence to believe it. In case she believes something, but recognizes that she has insufficient evidence, she would feel compelled to warn her interlocutors. Similarly, she might expect her interlocutors to act in the same way, to the point that if they don't, she might feel entitled to reprimand them and consider the whole situation almost as a form of lie or deception. There is discussion among specialists regarding how many evidentials Quechua has. There are at least 3. It is necessary to add the direct evidence suffix me in a sentence if the speaker is certain of what she's saying, because she has observed it personally. This evidential indicates that the speaker expresses her statement on the basis of the best available evidence. In that case, she takes responsibility for the truth of what she says. And in principle, she should be willing to justify her beliefs and reveal her sources of knowledge. If what she says turns out to be false, she would normally be called a liar or a seriously confused person. For example, huk runem hamur kan. It would be translated into English as, I know a man came. In this case, the sentence expresses the speaker's epistemic attitude, her conviction, and her epistemic responsibility. That is, her guarantee that what she affirms is the case. Unlike the previous sentence, the indirect evidence suffix C is used when the speaker is not sure of what she is saying and only repeats something she has heard. For example, huk runes hamurkan. There is also the conjectural or inferential suffix chi or cha. Chi is in central Quechua and cha in southern Quechua, which is used to indicate possibility, doubt, inference, or even desire. For example, Aicha mikui ta cha munan. It would be translated as he probably wants to eat meat. By using the suffix with even more clarity than in the previous case, the speaker does not commit to the truth of what she says and may suggest a conjectural epistemic attitude so that she does not take responsibility for the truth of the proposition. The important thing is that the speaker is only responsible for the truth of what she says in the first case, not in the other two cases. Diane Hintz and Daniel Hintz argue that there is an evidential mutual knowledge. This is really interesting, which refers to the knowledge built by the interaction between the interlocutors, which would make it possible for the speaker to distinguish between individual knowledge and shared knowledge, not understood as knowledge previously shared by the interlocutors, but rather as that built in this particular communicative interaction itself. This evidential expresses knowledge built by the interlocutors in the communication process as a kind of intersubjective knowledge, product of the agreements that are formed in the linguistic interaction. These authors found these evidentials in the Quechua of Conchucos, that's in the central area of Peru. All languages have different resources for expressing what languages with evidential expresses morphosyntactically. But the difference is that in some languages such as Quechua, the use of evidential suffixes is mandatory. So it is mandatory to specify the source of information, which would imply the degree of conviction and epistemic responsibility. Now, this does not imply, obviously, that this kind of a speaker is more truthful or more aware of the validity of what she says. This is a phenomenon that in most cases is not conscious, but that involves complex cognitive processes. Thus, we can affirm that having been educated in Quechua as her mother tongue, the brain of this speaker distinguishes in mechanical, automatic, and not always conscious way between the various sources of information that justify her assertions, whether she saw it, she was told about it, she infers it, etc., between her own epistemic attitudes towards those assertions, if she knows, believes, or suspects, and between statements for which she is considered epistemically responsible and statements for which she is not, in a more natural way that in the case of a speaker of a language that does not have an evidential system. A particularly interesting case of epistemic intuitions in Quechua occurs when one attributes epistemic attitudes to another person to describe epistemic situations in which the speaker believes, knows, suspects, etc., something. She can use epistemic verbs in Quechua, but she's obliged to use markers of evidentiality. However, when describing the epistemic attitudes of a third person, as when in English we say, she believes that P, she knows that P, etc., evidential suffixes cannot be used, since the speaker cannot be certain of the epistemic attitudes of the other person. That is, the speaker cannot take responsibility for whether the other person really knows or believes something, since she cannot have evidence of it. Thus, then, the word ni is used, which would be translated into English as to say something, but with some peculiarities. In English, we would express something like X believes that she will not go tomorrow, where the verb allows a direct sentence complement, so that the verb believe expresses the epistemic attitude X believes that P. Hence, in Quechua, these concepts can be lexicalized with evidential suffixes When the speaker wants to express epistemic attitudes of third parties, she uses the verb say, ni, but formulated as a direct quote from the epistemic attitude of the third person. Thus, then, one would not say, X thinks he will not go tomorrow, but I will not go tomorrow, says X. Pakarin manam lak chunin. In English and other Indo-European languages, the truth value of sentences in indirect contexts is in the epistemic verb. If I say I believe that she believes that tomorrow she will not go, the truth value of the sentence lies in my epistemic attitude of belief, so that I may or may not be true that I believe it. Secondarily, there is the truth value of the subordinate clause. She thinks she won't go tomorrow. But in Quechua, the truth value is in the verb to say. In I'm not going tomorrow, says X, the truth value is in whether she says it or not in whether she believes it, and even less in whether I believe she believes it. My claim is that the morphosyntactic peculiarities of languages could encourage one to have certain epistemic intuitions and not others, in addition to universal ones, if they exist. The point is that if one is a Quechua speaker, she would be obliged by her language to pay attention, whether consciously or not, to consider epistemic attitudes that an English speaker would not be obliged to consider. Certainly, being an English speaker does not prevent paying attention to what the Quechua speaker pays attention to, but the latter would be obliged to do so due to the morphosyntactic characteristics of her language. Obviously, one can learn different languages with different epistemic intuitions and adopt them all at all times or at different times. Furthermore, the comparative empirical analysis of the epistemic intuitions contained in the different languages could show us which ones are universal and which ones are not. But it is necessary to confront a possible misunderstanding. I do not wish to suggest that there is a clearly delimited set of epistemic insights that are present in every culture or language. First, neither languages nor cultures are clearly delimitable. Second, speakers of the same language and members of the same culture could have different epistemic insights if they had been exposed to something as simple as different greetings. So I am neither arguing nor assuming the existence of compartmentalized sets of epistemic intuitions with clear boundaries. The relationships between concepts from different languages and cultures are of overlap and family resemblance. The same occurs with inferential relationships between concepts and with epistemic intuitions. The causal influence relationships between language and culture are not unidirectional, but multidirectional. That is, the intuitions that are consolidated in a community tend to be part of the morphosyntax and semantics of their language. Likewise, these characteristics affect the beliefs of that community. But the way in which the influence of language on cognition is clearer is when an infant acquires a language in the community. When that happens, the child implicitly adopts some epistemic intuitions typical of that community, many of which are contained in the semantics of the language. But if that speaker grew up exposed to a different cultural tradition, the intuitions could overlap. However, the mere fact of acquiring a language and its morphosyntactic characteristics, as in the case of the Quechua Evidential system, would encourage the speaker to grow up paying more attention to certain relationships between events and objects of reality. That would have happened if she would not have grown up in that language. Additionally, spending a lot of time speaking a certain language, and therefore being obliged by that language to attend to certain relations of reality would have a structural effects on the brain of the speakers, given the brain's plasticity. If one is used from birth to making assertions or recognizing connections in reality, because her language demands it, it is likely that she will generate new neural networks that allows her to be faster in making or recognizing those associations. For example, if one is used to distinguishing, even in an unconscious way, between information for which she is responsible and information for which she is not responsible, as in the case of evidential languages, she will probably develop a practice that will not have a speaker of a language that does not have an evidential system. There is an additional and final point that I will not dwell on now. It seems important to question a widespread practice in philosophy of analyzing the semantic characteristics of a language, often Greek, Latin, German, English, or another Indo-European language, assuming that in doing so, we are also analyzing some universal cognitive traits of the human being, which is the universalist position. In relation to this point, my objective has been to point out the need to pay more attention to linguistic diversity, being alert to the risk of considering structural features of human cognition as characteristics that could be just typical of only a few languages. Thank you very much for your generous attention.